thank you all for being here. There might be some more people popping in as we go along. These are our, if you haven't been to one of these before, these last about an hour. These are our framing and action webinars that we do like every other Monday night around specific issues. Tonight, there's going to be a bunch of times for audience participation. So we'll ask you at that time if you want to just shout out some answers, or you can put them in the chat. And I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the meeting. So anytime you want to type anything, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. Please mark it very clearly as a question with a bunch of question marks, because people will, you can type stuff in the chat all the time. And we love that because there's lots of wisdom that comes through the chat. But if there's a specific question you want to put in the chat, just make sure it's called out with question marks so that I can see it. And I think we'll get started. These last about an hour. We will be done with our content portion by 8 o'clock. And then if there's some people who still want to talk a little bit, we can hang around for another 15 or 20 minutes and so on, talk a little bit more. So now I will turn it over to George.
Well, hello, I'm glad everybody's here, and thanks. We're seeing people come back, and that's great, and new people, so that's wonderful. Also, for those, some of you have chosen the pay what you will tickets. I just want to say thank you, both Lisa and I. It helps us do what we do. And so we'll move on to voter suppression. And I chose that title because that's what everybody's talking about it as. I think you'll see there may be some better ways to talk about this as we get going. But this is a big topic, and there's a lot to it. There's a lot of messaging around it. What we hope to do tonight is get you started with this, and we'll have some links with further, more in-depth messaging on this topic. We've found some really good ones out there, so we'll direct you in that direction. And just kind of this is more of a general framing thing, but I think it's important to think about when we talk about this topic, which is that so much of what we hear and internalize is very unconscious. It kind of slides by us during the day. We hear words that we recognize, and we know what people are saying, but we don't always sit back and look at how that they really expand out from their original meanings. And inside your brain, of course, it's expanding out to other frames and other areas of your brain that hold other ideas. And so, but no matter what, the words that we have, the words that we hear have an effect on us, whether we're really conscious of them or not. And so framing there are many definitions of framing you'll hear from me, but here's another one. Framing is all about being ready to pay attention to the words we hear and to think more deeply about them so we can uncover the whole story behind them. So we talked before, frames are stories, and it's if you learn nothing but that you're going to be looking at words and phrases and frames and thinking about what stories they tell, that will get you a long way towards being able to frame. Because if you do that and you end up with a clear perspective about what's happening, then you'll kind of automatically say things that are more likely to reinforce our message and diminish the opposition's. So I don't know, I thought that was just something to keep in mind. It's really all about practicing and noticing. So on this topic, I should say that what's interesting is actually, like any or many other issues, we actually have the advantages at this time. Voters are on our side. As it turns out, they appear to be on our side in a lot of what the president's doing. So things are looking up. And so this is a time that we must seize and make sure we're out there, reinforcing those messages and saying the things we need to say. And the voters are on our side, not by a little. They're a lot.
A lot. Yeah.
What's that?
I know I reminded.
Oh, okay. So there's information here that we've gotten from Voting Rights Lab and some other groups that have formed a coalition, and there are some. They did some focus groups. So just to give you an idea, that they focus group certain phrases. They found that the one that was polled the highest was fair elections. That was 93% of people, and this was a cross-section of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. Freedom to vote was at 90%. Voting rights was at 89. Voters' rights was at 84. And national standards for voting access was at 82. And out of those, I think the only one that might be somewhat ambiguous is maybe fair elections, because I could see people maybe on the right saying, oh, I'm for fair elections. And by fair elections, they mean not everybody votes or election integrity and things that we'll talk about later. But I think that's pretty important that we do have the voters on our side, and there has been some focus group work on this research. There's also support for both of the bills, and one of them is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is H.R. 4, and this is to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act to make sure that any changes to local or state elections are federally reviewed. So basically, we had a Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court kind of said, no, you don't anymore, and this is trying to get it back in there. So I think that's good. And then H.R. 1 and Senate 1 is the For the People Act. That's guaranteeing that voting options such as early and mail voting are equally accessible across all 50 states, prevent attempts to erect deliberate barriers to voting for Black, young, and new Americans, restrict lobbying and money in politics, and guarantee that congressional districts are drawn to ensure fair representation for all. So I think it's important to know that those things are on the docket right now and will be acted on and voted within the next few months. And I'll just remind people that if you are in a place where there's any doubt about the vote of your congressperson or senator, phone calls really matter. If you can get them face to face, that's great, but phone calls really matter. And then after that, a handwritten letter. Last on the list are those petitions you sign. Most of those are fundraising emails anyway. But if you can take that moment and reach out, you won't get the senator, you won't get the representative, you'll get a staffer, but that's tallied. And that stuff from everything that every elected person has told me, that they really listen to that. So, okay. Also, I should point out that it turns out that one of the things that the GOP has put out here that isn't working for them, so we talked about what is working for us, but what's not working for them are their states' right angle. It just doesn't seem to be hitting anywhere. They're also aware that our messages are hitting and that there's support for what we're doing. They appear to be a little bit worried about it. But for us, this concept of national standards, taking this necessarily or out of the hands of the local governments or the state governments, that having some kind of national standard so it's fair around the country, that is landing pretty well. People seem to get that. So, okay. And then for those who haven't been here before, we're going to go through a process that we call Stop, Drop, and Roll. And it's just a way to remember what it is that we can do when we're trying to frame. And a quick review on that is that in the stop phase, we want to stop and not just respond, because we quite often just feel we need to respond immediately. And by doing that, we tend to miss a lot. So we just step back for a moment, think about what's going on. What are people saying? This is probably the most important thing to do to begin with. What is everyone saying? What are we saying? What is the media saying? What is our opposition saying? And if you hear coffee shop conversation or whatever, what are people out there in the world saying? And then the drop part is there's stuff that we say that isn't so good. For example, we'll use our opposition's frames and we'll use our opposition's messages quite often to repeat or debunk them, which doesn't really help us either. And so there are things we need to stop doing, right, and drop. And then the last part of this is rolling, which is basically making messages framed in our values and talking about people. So we'll do all of these tonight, but let's start with kind of an open session here where what we want is not long explanations. What we're looking for, what are people saying out there in terms of words or phrases, If you've managed to divine a frame from messages, say that too and identify it as such. And we're small enough here. Let's just, if you've got something, just go ahead and raise your hand or shout it out. You can also, if you want to, put it in the chat.
And you're all muted right now, so you'll have to unmute.
In Michigan, the phrase voter ID is easy is going around quite a bit.
Ooh, haven't heard that one.
Me either.
Oh, you're putting it in. Okay. Great. I don't have to type. Okay. And who else? There's all sorts of stuff being said here. There's one big one out there that also starts with voter.
Right, voter fraud.
Voter fraud. Yep. What else are you hearing?
The one I like, George, is that the people pick their politicians, the politicians don't pick the voters.
Yep. That's a good one.
Well, I hear the GOP talking about voting integrity, voter integrity.
Yep.
It's-
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. Voter integrity. A lot of these bills are claiming, what are some of these bills claiming to do?
Protect our voting rights.
Protect our voting rights. Yeah.
Also improve the quality of the vote.
The quality of the vote. Yeah, that's one we've been hearing. Yeah.
I think also the quality of the voter.
Yeah, I think, yep, absolutely.
I'm in Georgia, and what I hear is Jim Crow 2.0.
We're getting some good ones here. It's amazing however many times you think about these things, there's always stuff you didn't think about. This happens every time we do this. They're really good ones. Let's see. Has anybody divined a frame out of any of what is coming from the opposition? Or just another message?
Just looking through the comment sections of newspaper articles, it's safety. I want to be safe from my election being impacted or influenced by people who shouldn't be voting.
Okay. Yep. They're using a safety frame, not in a good way.
I'd just like to mention on the other side, a positive, just in casual conversation versus, like what I call, these are kind of catchphrases, words like everyone should be able to vote, using that somehow, using the word everyone, and also anytime. Like, why do you have to be, all these restrictions? Everyone should be able to vote at any time, within the election period, of course, that we define, but everyone and all the time. So, thank you.
Yeah, I like that. All the time is also early voting, something we're looking for. And
I've heard a fair amount of language that says we need to clean up the voter rolls, which implies that they're, dirty.
exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
There are the implications. A lot of what these messages have is not stated explicitly, but they're definitely there and connected to it. Let's see.
I thought it was interesting on the other side, in the last few days, Kevin McCarthy, breaking the Republicans' rules, had to go out and say the Republicans are not the party of nativist dog whistles. And so somehow there may be some way we could spin that into a message that, yeah, in fact, they are the party of nativist dog whistles, but maybe slightly different language, but
Well, luckily Kevin McCarthy broke the rule. You know, you don't use the frame, you don't talk about the frames that don't work for you. And next week, just a quick point out, next week, we're going to do or in 2 weeks, the topic is basically, we're going to go beyond the basics. And I'll have a video there for you, portions of a video that I saw, I think it was yesterday, day before, on not using the frames that aren't the right frames for us. And a congressperson, actually the head of the DCCC, getting in a word war with a news person and just saying all the right things, saying exactly what's going on that point. What is there anything else? I want to make sure everybody's got a chance.
Well, in Virginia, we're very fortunate that we have a Democratic House and Senate. So they've really transformed the electoral process here. And one of the big things is no excuse voting. Basically, you don't need an excuse no excuse early voting, sorry.
Yeah.
So that's really critical. So people don't have to make up stories to vote.
And no excuse
vote early.
absentee voting. I just threw in the word absentee also to add to that.
Yep.
Actually, I've seen that in two different places.
We're coming up with some really good ones here. I had some already written down, and these are we're adding good ones.
Oh, I've heard one, again, comment sections of newspaper articles. Voting should be hard.
Mm-hmm.
Voting should be hard. Okay.
And of course, in Georgia, it's easier to get a carry permit than it is to vote.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. And I'll be watching the news media as they cover this, and we should all watch them and see what things seem to be settling out with them, because that's always an issue, that the news media, even the news media that's on our side, makes major mistakes on this. Again, that video we'll have a couple of weeks from now. We'll show you that. Okay, well, I'm not going to push this forever. If you think of something as we're doing this, feel free to chime in. So we have a number of really good ones here. Some we hadn't heard of before, but voter ID is easy. So basically, they're trying to frame that voter ID is not a big deal. It's not hard. It's absolutely a piece of cake. Get that? Voter fraud, the big one where that's the distraction. They're claiming voter fraud. There is no voter fraud of any significance, certainly never been enough to change an election. But that's the distraction. Republicans like to, this is what, when I talk about in the stop phase, uncovering the real issue is what the conservatives are doing. The Republican, the Republican Party is doing to keep people from voting. That's the real issue. So of course they don't want to talk about the real issue. So they talk about voter fraud. And this came about a long time ago. This wasn't just this last election. They've known for a long time that they were engaging in tactics that threw up barriers to voting. And because of that, they needed to distract from that and have this other show going on over here, which is voter fraud, so that they could define everything about voting as voter fraud. So you see election integrity, which people brought up, election security, clean up the voter rolls. All of these are saying that there's something wrong with voting, with the voter. It's putting the onus or putting the blame on the voter. So in this one, there's a frame here that works really well on their side, and it's the crime frame. They like the crime frame, use it quite a bit. This in here, when there's a crime frame, here the villains are people who shouldn't vote. They're committing voter fraud. They're villains. The heroes are the Republicans who are going to enact legislation to make sure that the criminals don't do this. And the victims, of course, are the folks, the regular voter who has now had their vote diluted by people who are fraudulently voting. That's the frame they're using. It's not a value frame. Not all frames are values, but that frame works for them. So we want to stay out of that crime story, which is a bit of a segue to the drop section. We want to stay out of the Republican frames, and we don't want to use any of their phrases, and we don't want to use the particular words they use. We don't want to use fraud, election integrity, election insured security. Another one that they've been using is eligibility. The way they use it is ineligible. They talk about people who are ineligible to vote. This brings up the story and suggests that, again, it's a crime frame, but that there are people who shouldn't vote. If you're ineligible, you shouldn't. Well, okay, we get it about children. We get it if you're not a citizen, you don't get to vote. But that goes along when you think what's beyond that. Just think about the history of voting. It has been a history not of it has been mostly a history of disenfranchisement. And women had to fight, and Black people had to fight, and people are still fighting to get the vote. And so our history, and in the beginning, not everybody voted in the beginning either. This is it's important for us that eligibility thing, that's got to be out of there. We don't want to talk. What we want to do is expand voting access. We want every American we want every American to vote and have their freedom to vote, so that their voices can be heard. But in the drop phase, we want to stay out of the opposition frames. We do not want to repeat or debunk, because every moment you spend repeating the Republican frames just does that unconscious thing where the word gets in somebody's head and then it goes in there and it lights it up again. Okay, you just repeat it. The next time they hear it, it lights it up again. The brain is a physical object. The neural connections are made between ideas, and the more they're used, the stronger they get. Not to say that you're just a machine and you can't overcome that, but 90 or whatever, some huge percent of our processing in our brain is happening unconsciously. And so just be aware of that. Don't take the bait. So Republicans do quite often try to lay traps for us and throw out bait. They know that we're going to respond and we're going to argue with them. So the crazier their argument is, the more we go after it, saying that's nuts. That argument about voter fraud is crazy. There is no voter fraud. Why are you saying voter fraud? All we're doing is building those pathways to that idea. You don't want to say those words. And they're doing it to you on purpose. We suggest avoiding facts and logic. There's plenty of evidence and research to back up the fact that people, though they can be logical and that they can look at facts, it's just not our default way of thinking as humans. Our default way is making snap judgments, in the moment decisions that have a lot more to do with emotion and beliefs. So this is not a prohibition against speaking the truth or bringing up facts and logic. Just know when to do it and when not to. I wouldn't lead with that. You want to, if you have an hour with somebody, fine, go for it. But when most of us are volunteers who door knock and phone bank, we're out talking to voters. You have a minute or two at the door. You don't have time to get into all of the wonkish policy. You have time to make an emotional appeal, something that appeals to people with stories of real people and what real outcomes are. Also, kind of avoid vague arguments or process arguments, very, very general things. For example, improve democracy. There's some people have said that that we want to improve democracy, and they're specifically talking about the Voting Rights Acts that we're looking at here. And I don't know that that's implicitly evident in the words improve democracy. It's a very general thing. It doesn't mean a whole lot unless you get in to explain it. And if you have to explain your message, you don't have the right message. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of some of the things to drop from what we've talked about. Anybody have any questions? I've been going here at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Anybody have any questions?
George, I don't have a question, but I have two comments. One was when I was out door knocking, I was talking to a voter and I said, telling her that did she know that early voting started soon, or telling her the date that it opened. And she said, well, I don't like early voting. I don't go for that, she said. And I said, oh, and she said, I like absentee voting. I do that all the time, but early voting I don't go for, she said. And I said, well, do you know that they're the same thing? I said, they're just the same thing. I said, except you don't have to have an excuse. And she just said, I don't like early voting. So there was no thought process, no understanding. It was just a catchphrase that she had learned. And anyway, and so I just wanted to comment on that. But secondly, what are the numbers for anyone being caught dead voting? Has anybody ever found where somebody voted illegally for someone else?
Well, I spent my formative years. What's that?
I said, does anybody know that?
I spent my formative years in Chicago, and so that's kind of, I think, where that originated. I'll have to say, back then, maybe in the 60s and 70s, even the 50s, when Mayor Daley was the mayor, it would not surprise me in any way that dead people voted. But I don't think that kind of thing has been happening nowadays. I mean, you have to register to vote. You go there, you sign the thing.
Mhm.
I don't know. I haven't heard anything. Nobody's been bringing it up. So we, or at least lately, sometimes you hear the Republicans do it. I think most people dismiss it, but
Well, I
and
think
then-
with their eligibility or argument, that's what they're saying. People are voting for dead people, and that's what I've heard.
yeah.
Oh, they think that's what's happening if you're allowed to go in and vote before.
Yeah, for somebody who's died. Yeah, similar to a welfare fraud. With those implications.
Well, at least
Yeah.
in Minnesota, part of that tells me they haven't actually done early voting, because I think it's actually more rigorous to go in early and it is to go in, because we went in to vote in our mayoral primary on the day before actual voting day, and my son forgot his ID and he didn't have his any of his ID numbers memorized, so we had to go back home and get it. And I'm like, if it was voting day, you wouldn't have needed to do that. So
Yeah.
so it's kind of that tells me then there's another question sort of related to this too. Does it really help to call it early voting? Why isn't it just voting? And some of it makes me wonder if it's not because of the processes and procedures involved in what's early voting. You are going to have to do things a little bit differently than if you go in on voting day. But I don't know if that's why there's that distinction anymore, because right now that there's not an excuse required, what difference does it make?
And personally, I'd just like to see us not really use absentee voting unless we need to, because but early voting makes all sorts of sense. Absentee voting doesn't imply, it implicitly says, in effect, that you're not going to be there. So you can't vote in your precinct. So you have to get this absentee thing. And, you have to attest that you are going to be absent. Why we even have that anymore, I don't know. I don't see why it's not just all early voting. And in fact, that is the messaging guidance that the Voting Rights Lab is giving, that we talk about early voting, that the idea is to expand the time for people to vote. There's absolutely no reason why it has to be one day. And where we've done it, it's working. In fact, we found that even mail-in voting is working extremely well everywhere. So let's taking that, let's little white lie. Well, yeah, I'm not going to be in the precinct, because I'm going to be outdoor knocking in 3 towns over. I think those days of that way of thinking about voting need to be gone. And then when you said the person was talking about, well, I don't like early voting, but I like absentee voting. What's interesting there is, think about the person you have. You've got somebody who's getting a couple different messages. It's like the person who says, keep your government hands off my Medicare.
or Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act. I hate
Right, right.
Obamacare, but I love the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. One part of their mind, luckily, understands that the concept of being able to vote not on election day is something that they like. But because they're hearing these messages and they identify with being conservative, or all their friends are, and they want to fit in with their friends, so they can't be heard to say that they are in favor of early voting, even though they don't quite understand that they are. So you may have it in there with that person.
I think that was a phrase that Trump started, and he used it very effectively, because he would say, I do absentee voting. I don't do early voting. It's absentee voting.
You
So
did.
early voting is not good, but that's what I do, So people fall for that.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa.
Carrie,
Linda?
did you have a?
Oh,
I
I'm
just wanted to say something, because language is so important, just what you're saying, George. And I don't really like, now that we're talking about it, absentee voting, early voting, it all has certain connotations the other side is using to make it into something not good. Perhaps we can think about different messaging. Maybe something just came to my mind, another term, early ballot voting, or advanced ballot voting, or some other terminology that you're still voting by ballot. You're not.
I see what you're saying.
Because you can be in person and turn that ballot in to your clerk.
I like that.
You're not being absent. You can be very present. So yeah, I think we could find another message to really resonate with people. You're not absentee balloting. You could go to the clerk and hand it in. You can be very present.
And we can get creative with these messages. I think that's a great point, Linda, and it points up the fact that the concept of early voting, or really what is an expanded voting period. That's a concept that a lot of people really like. I think everybody understands. Gee, if I can buzz down to the city hall and cast a vote when nobody else is around, just do it when I'm off going to Costco or whatever, then people like that. And but I like your idea of being a little creative with it, early ballot voting, to just nail home the fact that, yeah, it's a ballot. I'm casting my ballot. Everybody knows they get to cast a ballot. And so I like that. These framing isn't finding the perfect bumper sticker. There are a lot of people who think that framing is, well, we just need to have that one thing, some kind of magical word that if we say just this one thing and repeat this one thing over and over, everything's going to be perfect. And that isn't really the case. I mean, yes, we want some messages we all share and that dominate, but you're in a situation where you feel like, we're saying, let's emphasize the fact that there is ballot voting. Put that in there, go for it. That's great. And your message will change depending on who you're talking to from time to time. You're talking about a school levy, let's say a school technology levy. You're going to be talking to a young family with children and giving them maybe different values they want to look at. Like your kids are going to get the knowledge they need to compete in the world and to live fulfilled lives. And whereas you might talk to a small business person and use a completely different frame. So I like that.
And George, you had used the term, kind of a range, a period of voting. And then I'm seeing in some of the comments, people talking about a voting window. And in that regard, maybe instead of saying election day, I don't know if this is really a good idea or not, but call it the last day of voting, the last day of in-person voting.
That's really smart.
I like that a lot.
Early and absentee both sound kind of improper. Like early is like too early, and absentee is, well, like you should have shown up, and you're not really supposed to be absent from school, and you're going to get marked down for that. They both sound a little bit related to that crime frame, where that other idea, sorry, what was the phrase again about the last day of voting, or a voting period, or I'm going to mail my
voting window,
a voting window, or I'm going to mail my mail-in ballot in before the deadline. That all sounds okay.
Yeah, ballot window also, voting window.
I've been capturing, I don't know if you have the Google Doc up, but I've been capturing some of the chat and the talk of the framing on early voting. And what I have so far is our votes count no matter when they are cast. a voting time frame, voting window, ballot window. Election day is the last day of voting. So I'm trying to capture some of these things in a Google Doc that George and I have that we'll share back out. We'll try to tighten it up and share it back out with you, like in a day or two.
I'm gonna move here to the role section, and these are great ideas. I love when we do this because so many people come up with things that we've never heard before. We find this in our workshops too when we do exercises. We do one exercise where we look at a Ronald Reagan ad from ages ago and pick it apart. And we've done it probably 50 times. And every single time somebody sees something in that ad that nobody else saw, it's absolutely amazing. And so that's why I love this. You know, we're all doing this together. We're all thinking about how we're messaging, and just the simple act of doing this and doing it together is making us better at it. So I don't know. I get excited about that stuff. I don't know about you. So let me give you an idea of some things, again, from that research done, Lake Research and Voting Rights Lab and Brennan Center and some others that they focus grouped. And here are some things that came out great. And there's some good, really good core frames in here. Number one is freedom, the freedom to vote. You can also say protect our freedom to vote. You can put the protection frame in there. This also polled well, have a say in our democracy. Americans have a say in our democracy. And I think that one comes right along next to the one where voters pick their leaders and leaders don't pick their voters. We're in charge. There's a kind of a frame that I use a lot, is that the Americans are in charge. This is what's different about America. This is what the genius of the founders was, is that the king doesn't get to decide, the church doesn't get to decide, and the House of Lords, the landed gentry, don't get to decide. The people, they put the locus of power into the people and said, this is, you are in charge, you can do it. And public education came out of that. So I think that's an important one. The right to vote also is very strong. And a friend of mine, Philip Adam, he's the electric car guy here in Minnesota. Philip says he likes putting the word sacred in front of some of our most basic rights. So he says the sacred right to vote. I like that. I think Hobie said that before too. Fair elections. The fairness frame is a really good one. This one came out of you'll see this in one of the linked documents we'll send to you for Replace and Embrace. And this is enact policies that deliver on our democratic promise. And that's a good opening to talking about expanding the franchise, making sure everybody who should vote votes. Justice is always a good one to put in there, because we know where these these anti-voter bills are coming from. They're very deeply rooted in racism, and they're deeply rooted in historical events and legislation that we've had in this country that prevents people of color from voting and have prevented women from voting for a long time, which brings up the deliberate barriers to voting. So there's barriers, but calling them deliberate barriers. Now, you know, when somebody puts up a barrier, that's not a good thing. Maybe it's good for Trump and his wall people, but for most people, they don't like barriers. And you're a voter and there's somebody's putting a barrier up in front of you. That's not good. That one polls very well. Another one, denying our freedom to vote. There's a taking frame. Normally, I don't like using conservative frames to convince people of anything, but this taking frame is a real basic human frame. And I know the Republicans use it a lot, but denying our freedom to vote is really basically taking your vote away. And I think that is an okay frame for us to use. Anti-voter policies. I think that's important too. Not just anti-voting, but anti-voter, because somebody's against the voter. And if you're against a voter, you're against an American. You're against democracy. Another word that was suggested is voices, ensuring that every voice is heard. So again, all of us make these decisions. All of us are empowered, not even empowered. It is an inalienable right of us to be able to go and vote and make our voice heard. We should be pushing the concept of inclusive democracy rather than exclusive. Republicans want to exclude people. We want to include people. And lastly, choices. And this gets right to the voters pick leaders. Leaders don't pick voters. Yeah, the leaders are not the ones who decide this. Once they're in office, they get to decide things, but they're there at our pleasure. We get to choose them. And if they don't meet our needs, we get rid of them. The ultimate power lies in us. So anyway, any questions on that part?
I'd like to see all of those in writing. If you have a Google, yeah, I'd love to see those in writing. Those sounded great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those we definitely will get these back out to you. We have them in writing and we're capturing even more. So we will send this back out to all of you guys.
And Carrie, I think you had something too.
Okay, so here's where I get kind of hung up. So I'll just pick out one of the things that you said, deliberate barriers to voting. So when you talk about that, it's like, okay, here's the truth, everyone. This is what's going on. These people are putting up deliberate barriers to our voting. And then we have to somehow then go on the positive talking about our, right? Because we don't want to sit there still, right, and say, look at all the stuff you did. Because somehow somebody who identifies with Republicans, right, is going to feel shame or confusion or whatever. So I still need to, in my brain, go, how do we do this? Like, how do we tell the truth about what's really happening and yet focus on what we want to happen? Like, is it 50-50? What is it?
That's a really good question because, and I would almost say that there are times when it's appropriate, but in most times we want to be going with our positive vision, most of the time. So in terms of looking at what's going on with all of the rather bold agenda that the president and vice president have laid out, that with that stuff, we want to be talking about our positive vision. We want to totally ignore the Republicans talking about, oh, what about the debt and what about this and that, forget that stuff. Just stay on our message. I think in this case, there is a little bit of that having that frame there that says that the Republicans are putting up barriers to voting is something that a lot of people haven't thought about. Because if you're on the right, you're thinking that they're not barriers, they're protections. So, having sometimes we have to, as they say, name the villain in a way. Name the crime. That's another thing to think about in stories for frames, which is the victim, villain, and hero model, where who are the victims of the Republican anti-voter barriers are the as we said before, the people who should be able to vote and can't vote because they were prevented from it, and go through the victim, villain, hero story. Even if you don't say that, use those words, if you tell that story and it's implied, that's great. That's a really good question. Yeah.
Are you going to cover the values sandwich kind of approach here to answer her?
Yeah, let's talk about the value sandwich. Yeah, in fact, do you want to hit that, Hobie? Just because I know you know
that. Some of you may know Anat Shankar Osorio, out of Berkeley. I think she may be the heir apparent to George Lakoff, but she's got a process for, it's not a single frame, it's not a phrase, but I call it a value sandwich, and I simplified it a little bit. It is to start with an appeal that goes to our values, that goes across and shows racial solidarity. It then identifies how those values are being violated, and then puts our vision out of what we aspire to, and finishes with a call to action to bring people in. And so I'm doing some work on the Atlanta elections here, and it might sound like this if I read it, pardon me, but it's, no matter our race, background, or zip code, Most of us believe that for democracy to work for all of us, it must include us all. Throughout our history, we have fought to ensure more Americans have our right to vote honored, and that every voter, every eligible American is able to cast our vote and have it counted. All right, so there's values in that statement, that the what's going on, how are those being violated is, but a handful of politicians want to set us back, making it harder to vote and creating barriers to register for Black, young, and new Americans. They hope to divide and distract us while they block policies Americans favor from providing, and this is the vision, things we want them to do. It is providing economic support to delivering vaccines, to creating healthy cities, whatever cause you want to put in there. And then it is, moving back to that value. To move forward, we must assure all Americans come to the polls and cast our ballots so we're able to elect leaders who govern in our interests and make the promise of democracy real for all of us. So, and then, by the way, come and do X, Y, or Z, or join our call bank or whatever it is. So it's values, violation of values, vision, and return to values with a call to action.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, this is a really nice takeoff on the simplified version that Lakoff has, which is speak the truth first, and of course the first one to claim the message wins, and then acknowledge the lie and show how it violates values, and then state the truth again. But this is more nuanced. What Hobie's talking about, I really like, and I think it's important. I agree with Hobie, and not Shankar Osorio is doing or Rosario. I'll have to ask Federico on that. But she's something else. She does a really great job, and so she also worked with Voting Rights Lab and these other groups. So there's some very good material there. I think it's important, even though we do this work, I think it's important that you see other people who do this work. Last time we had Antonia Scatton, who worked with George Lakoff. We've had Hobie on before. Hobie is quite expert in the environmental area, but just an expert framer on top of it. And there will be more who will have. It's important. You hear these from different angles, different ways people approach it. You'll just learn more and more. Okay, thank you for that. Are there other questions on that? Does that make sense, everybody?
Can Hobie put a copy of that in the chat or a link to it?
I think George has it. George.
Yeah, you were reading off of that document.
Yep.
Okay, messaging guidance. Yeah, we'll have a link to the slides from Voting Rights Lab and to their message guidance. And then I think on there, if it's not there, I'll see if I can find if you want to sign up to see their webinars too. To give you an idea, we do things a little differently. They're coming out a lot with what you ought to say. So here's a lot of stuff that you ought to say on this. And that's important. I think it really helps everybody, but we like to spend time thinking about this and teaching it as a skill, because I think it's important that we don't just grab a piece of paper and talk off it, that we train ourselves to be able to make these messages when we're out there. None of us are perfect. I get caught all the time in these things, making a mistake or saying something that isn't as good as I could have said. But we're all learning, and the more you study, the less likely you are to make mistakes, and the more likely you are to really nail it. And you will find, I'll guarantee you, that when you come up with a good frame and you mention this to somebody, many of the people who've bought into the right-wing propaganda and who or sympathize with it, or at least hear it, it may never have heard it any other way. It just may never have occurred to them that there's any other way to see it. And so we've had a number of times when people have said, you know what, I never thought of it that way. We might not have converted them at that moment, but we planted a seed. So when you go out to the door and you're using these techniques, understand that you might actually have gotten someplace, even though you don't know it or you don't think so, because you pushed us forward.
I just put the link to the slides from the Voting Rights Lab, ASO Communications, and their and the messaging guide regarding this. I put that in the chat, but I will also send it out in an email in case sometimes it might be harder for you to grab something from the chat. So I'll put it out in an email as well.
And we'll get that link to you for if you want to see some of their messaging guidance webinars they do. They usually do them during the day, but the slides and the messaging guides are always available afterwards. And we'll get you a link if you want to sign up for those. Also, if those of you who were here last week when Antonia Scatton was here, we sent, we have information. She has some basically training sessions, kind of like what we do. And she's got those coming up here in the next few weeks. I think she starts.
One starts tomorrow.
One starts tomorrow. We can get a link to you for that. And another, I guess we're kind of moving on and out of this. On April 28th, here in Minnesota, but I think this is a good group. I think anybody, wherever you're at, you might find some interesting things here. This is the DFL Lawyers Committee. In Minnesota, DFL is the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. That's who we are. So we're DFLers. Everybody else are Democrats. And they're having an online event about anti-voting efforts that are sweeping the states right now and what is being done to stop them and how you can help. And we'll have a link to that also. And last, I'll just mention next time we're going to go we're going to start something called Beyond the Basics. We'll do these from time to time. A lot of people have taken our workshop, which is a 3-hour workshop that really gets your head set and you're oriented in the proper direction to be doing framing. But we want to go on that. There's little bits of psychology. There's tips and tricks, kind of a grab bag we'll have there. Have a video example or two. And I think it'll be kind of fun. It's just a number of different things to think about. So come on and do that. And I guess at this point, we're pretty close. We try to get out by 8. So if you've got to go ahead. We'll stick around a little bit afterwards. People want to yak and
Or if you have any more questions.
about
or-
15 or 20 or more questions.
Linda.
So not a question, but just as I'm listening to you, I am a trained mediator. I do mediation work for the county. And in mediation, you work with two parties who are in conflict with each other, and you try to find common ground. And I kind of use those skills when I'm out canvassing. You know, where is the common ground? Where's the core that we can come together? And maybe, you know, framing is part of that. You know, what can I find on the other side, you know, that we have a common value, and try to frame it in that way.
And we've talked about that in our workshops too. And we have found that, I found that myself when I'm talking with people, and I'm not a trained mediator, but I find that if we can get to a place where we share the same value around something, then you've got a place to start talking about it. So yeah, I think that, and we've actually talked about this a little bit in our workshops about how sometimes those values, they cross over.
Well, and let me point out that in the universe of values, you add up all of the conservative values, the liberal values, any other values you find, you put them all in a big pot. It turns out that because we all grew up in the same culture, we are all aware of all these values. Like hard work, for example. The Republicans claim hard work is one of their most core values. Well, the rest of us work hard. When I go to work, when I used to go to work, I worked very hard and liked getting paid for it. There's nothing wrong with that. There are plenty of values. What it is it's not that people don't have these values, is that they apply them in other parts of their lives. They don't apply them to politics. The parties, the conservatives doing a better job than we have, but the parties have picked the values that work for them for their policies. And they talk about that and they get people to focus only on those. But in your mediation work, I'm sure you've seen a zillion times where you found a value that everybody understood and that everybody could relate to. So now you have a basis for discussion. And we've heard from some mediators before, and also ministers who have engaged in that. And you have a advantage the rest of us don't, I'll say, because you're normally looking for those things.
George, I'd wanted to respond to Linda. Just I absolutely agree on the values side, but we have to, as liberals, be careful because
Yes.
there are some things on which we can't compromise. We can't compromise on some of the human values. So there's no compromise on racism, as an example.
Right, yeah.
Right.
And what we get is well, the right moved over here, and therefore to compromise, we have to move here. When indeed, sometimes the right thing to do is stand up for what you actually believe in. So I'm not trying to scold or anything. I'm saying it's a trap I fall into very often. Oh, if I just give a little on an issue, then everything will be okay. But all politics is based on morals, and they form the value of some of these frames. And I want to make sure we don't just go, oh, we must compromise, so let's move toward their position, when in fact our position, some positions we
Yeah.
can't move on.
Yeah, I agree with you, Hobie. You know, I'm not talking about compromising from our value point of view such that we become racist or whatever, segregationists or white supremacists. And
Yeah, I wasn't accusing you of that. It was just kind of a general.
no, I
Sorry,
get where you're coming from. Yes.
Yeah, I like a good writer, Rebecca Solnit, says that, you know, if we believe the earth is round and they believe the earth is flat, we're not going to get anywhere by agreeing that the world is oblong. It's just not going to work. But one other thing, don't ever use, and Lisa, I'll get to you in a sec. I'm sorry. Don't use conservative frames to convince conservatives. Do not reinforce those frames. Okay, I'm sorry, Linda.
Lisa.
Or Lisa, I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah, on that note, as far as not playing into their language or using their language, I'm an insurance agent, so I deal with folks that are signing up for quote unquote Obamacare. And you know, so like today I had this lady call me and she said, that's Obamacare, isn't it? And she said it in a tone of voice like that's a bad thing. And I said, well, you know, all health insurance in the United States now is Obamacare, and basically what it's doing, it's protecting you. It's giving you the protections on pre-existing conditions and blah blah blah. And I went on and on like that. So you know, it's the Affordable Care Act, and there are plans that are not that where you can get health insurance, but you're not protected. So I just want to let you know it's the whole context. It's the whole system now is the Affordable Care Act, and you know it's protecting you. And she said, "Oh, I didn't know that." You know, so it's like getting beyond what their frame of mind is on. You know, Obamacare is one plan, but it isn't. It's the whole system. It's the whole healthcare system. So, and I think I was able to turn her around, but initially she said, oh, you know, it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with Obamacare.
You planted a wonderful frame, planting the protection frame.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Lisa. It's Federico here.
Hola, Federico. ¿Qué tal?
Oh, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Oh, you know what I was going to say? There you go.
Glad you made it.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Awesome.
Are there any other questions or comments or interesting framing things or?
Sean? Well, it's great. It's great having you folks here. We love it. It's way too much fun. And I think we've learned so much. We'll get this out to you. There's some really interesting things people brought up tonight, and I think bear repeating.
George.
Yes, Federico.
Just one thing about this idea of democracy, right? And voting rights and such. Is it, has anyone tested, and I missed part of the whole thing because I was with my customer, but has anyone tested talking about democracy in terms of, you know, freedom to vote in terms of democracy and Republicans being anti-democracy and or something to that effect?
Yeah, you'll see some things in the links we send in some of those materials. But yeah, anti-democracy, there were anti-voter policies that were tested. Anti-democracy, I don't remember if that was tested. I don't remember what they said there. I think I'm not necessarily opposed to anti-democracy. I think in this case, anti-voter is specific, but we're seeing all sorts of anti-democratic things from the Republicans. So I think this idea that the Republicans are they're anti-democratic can come up again and again with various issues. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but be prepared to explain yourself. Say anti-democratic, because that's a big slap.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. I mean, to me, and I've mentioned this to people, Republicans are a big threat on democracy. And very much what the Russians are on the global stage, the Republicans are in the US, a threat to democracy.
Well, and also frame their actions, their policies as anti-democratic, which will then rub off on them. But it's really the policies. And Republicans as a group, have wrestled with this for a long time. I know Patty and Peter were some of the first people who came to our workshops, and Julie Ethan, who helped put this all together. Julie and I go back and forth. What do we call the opposition? Are they conservatives? Are they Republicans? Are they the old style Republicans, rational Republicans, as opposed to extreme Republicans? And I think luckily that's kind of solidified for us here since January 6th and since the election. The Republican Party has been taken over by the extremists. There are Republicans out there who aren't crazy people. In fact, one show I watch fairly often is Morning Joe, which is headed by Joe Scarborough, who is now, I guess, a former Republican, but still a conservative. But the show has Republicans or has conservatives and liberals on together every single day. And it's interesting the amount of overlap there is. I learned from that ways that I can talk to people who aren't the QAnon, the people who are a little more rational, and I pick up pointers there because I can point to people on the right who agree with us and who were how many of them came out and said vote for Joe Biden, prominent Republicans.
So, given the original question about using the words democracy, and I pulled up the voting guide that I'll be sending out to you. You'll see this yourself, and you can look through these and see if there's other things that resonate with you. But one of the things they said that the words improve our democracy or fix our democracy, they're actually not recommending those words. Right. They say what the reasoning is that emphasizing why we need to pass progressive policies around voting in elections, our persuadables were significantly 10 points more likely to rank it as urgent and necessary when tied directly back to having a say in tangible outcomes rather than broad notions of improving democracy. So that was some of the rationale they had behind that. And that's just a quick look at this. You'll probably find more information in this guide about the use of the word democracy in this particular case and around voting rights.
And fix democracy or fix voting it says that there's something wrong with voting the way it is. But we know from the last election that the last election went extremely well with early voting, with mail-in voting, with absentee voting, with the counting of the ballots. Everything went very well. Our voting system works fine. Not everyone is able to vote because they're being prevented from doing so. So.
And not everyone, is willing to play fair and square and win fair and square.
Yeah. Yep. It's the effect of big money. That's why I like in these bills, there's the getting rid of dark money. If you feel that strongly, if you feel $10 million strongly about an issue, well, then you ought to stop being a coward and get out there and say who you are. And I think if the legislation makes them do that, then more power to us. That's good. We need to know who it is that's tearing our democracy down.
Mm-hmm.
Well, everybody, thanks again. tremendous fun. Hope to see you next time, and tell your friends and bring them along.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Well,
connectionslab.org.